The Baroque flute is a much discussed subject, with little specific records indicating where progress was made on this instrument and who exactly did it. Researchers must utilize second-hand articles, portraits, and knowledge of popular instrument makers at the time of its emergence in order to even propose theories about the Baroque flute. In 1969, Philip Bate wrote a book simply entitled The Flute. In this book, he speculates that although the world widely recognizes the flute as the transverse flute during the time of the Baroque, we must be more specific in dates to truly identify its form. Any flute before the classical flute that we now know could technically be considered a transverse flute. The flute itself saw its beginnings in ancient Egypt and Asia, as depicted in art that we can still see today. Since then, it has undergone many different forms, and the Baroque flute did not truly emerge until somewhere around 1670. Instruments in general were often looked down upon during this time because of their connection with the theater and stage, but the tradition of music in this form was kept alive, essentially, by traveling musicians. In addition, the flute and recorder were always regarded as one instrument, telling us that a vertical flute was the norm until the 17th century. Louis XIV favored the recorder himself. Finally, in 1683, a document states that Henry Purcell was appointed keeper, maker, repairer, mender, and tuner of musical instruments composing of flutes and recorders. This is the first source that lists the flute and recorder as two different instruments, marking a significant emergence of the instrument. Other significant landmarks for the Baroque flute can be seen in records of musical performances and depictions. The first orchestra that the flute is included in is Lully's Les Triomphes de l'Amour in 1681, its low and dulcet tones perfect for the theme of l'amour. Later in 1692, the Baroque flute would be first depicted in Maran Marais' Pieces in Trio, which shows multiple musicians playing and singing together, one of which is playing a Baroque flute. Now, it may be pertinent to actually explain features of the Baroque flute that separate it from its predecessor, the Renaissance flute. The Baroque flute, like the Renaissance flute, had 6 holes, but it also had an added 7th hole that is covered by a key in order for the pinky to be able to reach it. This is known as the D-sharp key. In addition, the 6 holes are generally closer together in groups of 3, and rather than the flute being one whole entity, the Baroque flute is separated into 3 or 4 pieces. The instrument featured a cylindrical head joint but a conical body, which allowed for better tuning and effectively flattened the scale to sound a natural D scale. Still, John Sollum, writer of the early flute, says that tuning was not the strong point of this instrument. Baroque flute's tuning ranged from A392 to A415, and were often so unpredictable that harpsichords would have to be retuned daily to fit the flute's pitch. Later on, middle joints of different sizes would become popular in order for the flutes to adjust their pitch more drastically. Professional flute players would often have 4 to 5 different middle joints to ensure correct tuning. Now the question arises, who is to thank for the then new technologies that progressed the flute? The most popular belief is that it was the Hoteter family, a family with a long lineage of court musicians and instrument makers. This family not only worked with flutes, but also with every other woodwind instrument, being mostly responsible for evolutions of oboes and bassoons during that time. They served the courts of Louis XIV as long as he reigned. Family members included Jean, Martin, Louis, and Nicholas, but the most well-known among them is Jacques Martin Hoteter, who lived from 1680 to 1760. Jacques Martin lived during the time that the Baroque flute was most popular, so although he would not have idealized the new technologies on the instrument, he surely would have continued work on it. There are quite a few signs that point to the Hoteter family being the primary makers and ultimately creators of the Baroque flute. First, the family comes from a village in Normandy that specialized in wood turning in conjunction with instrument making. In fact, companies such as Louis Lot and Buffet trace back to this same village. Second, a speculation made by Philip Bate in particular piques my interest. He says that it seems unlikely that the men who had successfully turned their attention to 3 of the most used woodwinds would neglect the 4th. It is true that the Hototere family are recognized for making marked strides in the evolution of the other woodwind instruments. Since they were some of the first documented distinguished flutists, it seems unlikely that they would ignore the one instrument that they have the most interest in. In addition, the Hototere family themselves developed what we call cross flutes, which were the first flutes to be played horizontally. J.J. Quantz, an extremely well-recognized flute player at the time, also documents that Germans adopted the French model of the Baroque flute 50 to 60 years after it had been introduced. This puts the creation of the flute around the right time and further indicates that the Hototeres created it. Finally, Jacques-Martin Hototere himself penned the famous book, Principles of the Flute, Recorder, and Oboe, which has been translated and published in the United States since 1968. He claims that he wrote the book because his instrument was gaining so much popularity that he felt an obligation to give people knowledge on how to play it properly. This is a direct claim that he and his family created the instrument single-handedly. Because of all of these reasons and more, the Hototere family is said to be mainly responsible for the emergence of the Baroque flute. There are, however, some other theories on who could have been responsible for the Baroque flute, though there is substantially less evidence backing them. John Sollum lists multiple flute makers who could have added to the success of the instrument in his book, The Early Flute. For example, Richard Haka from Amsterdam lived during the same time frame of Jacques Hototere and was said to have bridged the gap between the Renaissance and Baroque eras. The flute he coined had the same look of the Baroque flute, but played in the key of B rather than D. Regardless of if he is connected to the Baroque flute in D, this still shows that at the very least, Holland and England must have been in contact with each other during this time. In addition, once the Baroque flute moved from 3 pieces to 4, Bresson was the most notable flute maker. Karl August Gesner was also an influential maker in Germany who enhanced the tonal beauty of the instrument. Jacob Denner's workshop was also a big name during this time. Finally, Quantz himself is said to have had influence, but it is quite clear that he could not have been the actual creator of the flute. All of these are just names that were recognizable during this time, so it may be possible that the Baroque flute emerged in one of their workshops. The Baroque flute was popular for about a century before flute makers attempted to fix its obvious problems with tuning. J.J. Quantz started the trend by adding a second key and a screw cap and cork mechanism in 1730. In addition, other foot joints were invented that could lower the pitch of the flute. In My Complete Story of the Flute by Leonardo de Lorenzo, it is said that flute makers started adding additional keys to continue to fix tuning problems. Keys were added for inharmonics of each note. First, an F key was added, then a G, and so on, until we came to the style that we have now, the Boehm flute. The history of the Baroque flute is a vast and questionable one, but the research that historians have done have led us to a closer look of what may have actually happened so long ago. For now, the Hototere family will be recognized as the original creators of the instrument. Music still exists today for the flute to be played, but it is mostly regarded as a part of history that should be left behind.